Good morning, Ospreys. Good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives too. And this morning, I am delighted to welcome back to our show Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization. Harley, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. It's a cold, wet morning here in Germany.
Yeah, okay, a little chilly here, but no rain. But I understand it's yeah, at this time of year, it's kind of hard to keep that positive attitude when it's raining and cold and you don't want to go anywhere. But we've been through it before, and we'll get through it again. This winter is going to be a kind of a rough ride. A lot of people have used the word dark winter going into the winter, and
I
it
think that
seems
was
like,
Biden who started it, wasn't it?
yeah, it seems like kind of a threat to me. Like, if you guys don't do what we want, you're going to have a dark winter. But I
Well,
don't
I
know.
think,
How do you interpret that phrase, Harley?
I don't know. I was just going to say, I think our governments are going to keep us out of the cold weather by new lockdowns, but at the same time, we may not have electricity to heat our homes. So I think
Mm,
that's what it means that we're going to have a dark winter. No energy, no commerce, no economy, no life as usual.
that makes sense.
But you can
Uh,
read by candlelight.
okay, I got my candle going this morning, so
I see that. I see
we're
that.
all set. Yeah. Um, and you know what? I found out I sent one of my books over to France, and not only did I have to pay like 15 bucks for the postage for a very light book, but also the person that received it had to pay a 10 euro customs fee just to get the book. And I thought, oh, I want to send my books over to Europe, but with all the hassle and filling out forms and all, I promised you I'd send you one, but I haven't sent it yet because I just haven't, but I will. I'm going to send you one, but you'll have to pay 10 bucks or 10 euros customs fee. Are you willing to?
Well, if that's what it costs to get your book, that's what I'll do. I had requested an over-the-counter allergy medication for my brother to send me, and not only did they confiscate it and fine me $274, but then I had to pay them an extra $100 because they had to keep it at the postal service for an extra week. So for not being able to get a simple antihistamine, it cost me almost $400.
Wow.
Thank you, EU,
Yeah, EU. Yeah,
protecting us from bad non-prescription medicine from America
yes, and books. God forbid
and
that you should
books.
get books,
God forbid your book should come here.
I know that was a special book rate too. It was like the cheapest rate I could possibly send it, but still. All right. What's the number one issue on your mind right now, Harley? I know over here we see things from our perspective, but it's often interesting to see it from your perspective over there in Europe and personally. What's the number one issue on your mind right now?
Well, I know everyone's focused on the Omicron and COVID, and this is roiling populations everywhere. But I'll tell you the thing that I'm watching very closely is the US and NATO provoking Russia. And if people aren't tuned into this, they better get tuned into it because this is an area where the slightest mistake could mean nuclear war. And by mistake, I mean you have jet planes, nuclear bombers flying back and forth to each other's border. You've got a naval flotilla moving in the Black Sea toward Russian territorial waters. You just had Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence of Biden, briefed the NATO General Staff last Monday on the evidence, the what I would say is the non-existent fabricated evidence that Russia is massing troops on the Ukraine border. The Russian defense minister Shoigu said, well, we do have some troops on the border, certainly not 90,000 or 100,000, but this is our border. And when NATO is carrying out maneuvers on the border, we've got to watch what's going on. You have this week, I think, Defense Secretary Austin was on the phone again. Blinken came over here. And what are they saying? They're saying that Putin has something up his sleeve, possibly an invasion of Ukraine in January or February. Now, the reality is that the US, the UK, and NATO are whipping up the Ukrainians to convince them that they should launch an offensive into eastern Ukraine. Now, for those of your viewers who don't know too much about this, I'll just very briefly summarize that the reason there's a crisis in Ukraine is that when Joe Biden was vice president and Obama was president, Biden was appointed the point man for the Ukraine coup. He worked with neoconservatives like Victoria Nuland in the State Department, with neoliberals like George Soros, who funded anti-Yanukovych marches and demonstrations. But the foot soldiers for the Maidan Square coup, the revolution in Ukraine, were groups called the Azov Battalion and the Stefan Banderistas, who traced their origins back to the Ukrainians who joined the Nazi SS in the 40s when Germany conquered Ukraine. And they served the Nazis by exterminating Hungarians, Jews, Russians, all non-ethnic Ukrainians. This is a group now, the Azov Battalion is embedded in the Ukrainian Defense Department. People of the Banderista movement are very influential in the security services in Ukraine. They've threatened Zelensky, the president, that he must not speak with Putin or make any deals with Putin. And I just was listening to BBC today, and one of the things they said is that they talked about the Russian invasion of Crimea. They didn't mention that Russia had been there. That was a Russian part of Russia until 1956, when it was returned by Khrushchev to Ukraine. But more importantly, there were Russian troops. It's a Russian naval base, Crimea, and there was a plebiscite, a vote, and over 90% of the people there, many of whom are ethnic Russians, voted to be returned to Russia. And so the idea that Russia invaded Crimea, that Russia invaded eastern Ukraine, where 60 to 70% of the population is ethnic Russian. And they're worried that under the new Kiev regime from the 2014 coup, that they are not going to have their rights respected. They won't be allowed to speak Russian. There were agreements made, the Normandy Four and also in Minsk, that there would be talks to grant autonomy within a federated structure of Ukraine for the Donbass region, the eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has never done it. And now there's a continued talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO troops in Ukraine. Poland is now calling for American troops to be permanently deployed in Poland to prevent against a Russian invasion. And the Russians are scratching their heads saying, look, this is not 1986. This is not the Ogarkov Doctrine. This is not the Warsaw Pact versus the West. This is NATO trying to justify its existence. And of course, the big defense budgets. But it becomes extremely dangerous. And I think most Americans, know something about Ukraine. They know there's a confrontation there. But once again, the so-called intelligence on Ukraine is a lot like Colin Powell showing pictures of taco trucks in the Iraqi desert, claiming these are mobile chemical weapons labs. We don't really know what the Russians are doing, how many troops they have. And one of the reasons we don't know is that NATO expelled the Russian diplomats from NATO. We just expelled another, I think, 100 diplomats from the Russian embassy and diplomatic community in Washington. So the United States is cutting off discussion with Russia and then asserting that Russia has malign intent toward the West. Now, the Europeans are getting quite worried about it, even though they tend to mouth the line that comes from Blinken and others. But they're the same way this existed in the 60s and 70s, when the French weren't sure you could count on NATO to risk losing Washington, D.C. to defend Paris. Most Europeans don't think the United States is prepared to go to war over Ukraine. So why provoke it? Why give Ukraine the go-ahead to threaten Russia? So this is the number one on my list right now. It's a very dangerous situation. The Washington Post, the New York Times are all writing about Russian intention, that Russia is still upset. They're putting pressure on Zelensky. Well, they're putting pressure on Zelensky to follow through the agreement that was signed by the Ukrainian government 10 years ago. or I'm sorry, 7 years ago at the Normandy talks. They're putting pressure on the US to have a discussion. And even though you had the Biden-Putin discussion coming up, there's supposedly going to be a summit, maybe even in December. The Russians are saying, how do we prepare for a summit when we can't talk to our American counterparts? So this is a very risky strategy. And for what? To con out of the Congress another few $100 billion for the defense budget? It makes no sense, but it seems to be somewhat typical of continuing the war hawk domination of the two Bush regimes, the Obama regime. Trump was different on this, and that's why he was attacked. You know, he said he wanted to be friends with Russia, and so he was accused of being a Russian puppet. And by the way, John, as you know, there's some interesting stories coming out around that with the latest indictment from John Durham of this guy, Igor Danchenko, which we can talk about, which also fits into this picture quite a bit. But that's what I'm watching primarily right now.
Well, you're right that Ukraine is a kind of a nowhere land for most Americans. It's a kind of a semi-country in our minds that has sometimes existed and sometimes hasn't. It doesn't even seem to have the staying power of a Poland, for instance. It is a place where an awful lot of grain has been grown historically. The breadbasket of Russia, it was called in former times. And so Russia has lost. If they lose Ukraine, they've lost a valuable source of food, and also the connection to the Caucasus with the oil. And those two issues were the issues of World War II, when the Soviet Union had to suddenly beef up its army from nothing to 10 million. And they did, and they won, but we're still dealing with the aftermath.
Well, and Ukraine, you mentioned it was the breadbasket. I mean, Russia has had a tremendous improvement in its own agricultural production because of their concerns over what might happen with Ukraine. But also, Eastern Ukraine has coal. This is where some of the Russian weapons manufacturers were located during the Warsaw Pact years. In fact, the Eastern Ukraine was one of the drivers of the Ukrainian economy up till 2014. I mean, Ukraine actually had become, in the first decade and a half of the 21st century, a relatively prosperous country. And I say relatively prosperous in that, you had a big gap between the rich and the poor, but the poor were improving, their living standards were improving, the country's GDP was growing. And after the coup, the International Monetary Fund came in, the economic hitmen, to advise Ukraine. And Ukraine has plummeted to the bottom in per capita income in Europe as a result of the great economic reforms brought in by the Columbia, Harvard mafia, the Western bankers, the IMF, and others. Ukraine was promised, if you orient toward the European Union, we'll make you rich, we'll make you prosperous, you'll become a Western European state. And instead, all they're getting is promises of weapons to protect them in case there's a Russian invasion. So, for Ukraine, they're getting nothing from this. You still have some of the worst oligarchs in the world in Ukraine, and they're trying to manipulate this question of the energy shipments precisely at a point where there's a fragility of the supply lines to Western Europe from the east, where they get most of their oil and natural gas. We're seeing spikes that are incredible here in utility rates. My utility bills this month went up 14% in 1 month. And the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was a combination of Gazprom and several Russian companies with companies in 11 Western European nations, that has not yet been certified by the European Union to provide natural gas. And so what are they doing? Here we are with the climate conference in Glasgow, and much of Europe is beefing up their coal burning for electricity. So it's just another example of the complete hypocrisy of virtually every aspect of policy in the transatlantic region. And the good news is this system can't continue. The internal contradictions are so profound. The hyperinflation, the fact that in order to keep the banks going, you have to keep pumping liquidity. But the more you pump liquidity, the greater the hyperinflation. If you stop the liquidity, you're going to have a domino-style collapse of corporations that are on life support. So what happens? Biden renominates Jerome Powell, the man who coined the phrase transitory inflation, to try and assure us that the little price hikes we were seeing at the gas pump last August will only last for a month or two. Well, get used to it, that it's continuing.
Yeah, and the dilution of the value of our dollar continues, and the impact of that, of course, is not immediate. It takes time for it to work its way in, and that now it's going to. I mean, gosh, they've doubled, tripled the money supply, and that means
Yeah.
there's going to be inflation. There's no way around it unless they can somehow hide all the dollars. Keep them out of America. Just you can have our dollars, but you can't spend them here. Maybe
Well,
that.
and the Republicans are saying the reason for the inflation is government spending. Well, government spending was up in the Trump years. It's gone up significantly in the first year of Biden. But that's not the major increase in dollar circulation. There were $13 trillion put into the economy, not into the economy, but into the banks from September 2019 to the present. It's actually maybe now 17 trillion. That's not.
That's doubling the amount of money that's in the negative account of our credit already. I mean, geez.
Yeah. Well, that's putting the equivalent of the 1 year national GDP into the hands of speculators who are buying and selling stocks, buying and selling bonds, derivatives transactions, and so on, which add nothing of real value to the economy except the profit that's made from their trading. And who makes the profit from the trading? The upper 1%. We've created, I think the figure is something like 200 billionaires. 200 people have become billionaires in the United States since 2016, I think it is.
Let me go back to Ukraine for a minute, if you don't mind. I'm going to go to
Sure.
Wikipedia and read a little bit of the Wikipedia article on Antony Blinken. Antony John Blinken, born 1962, is an American government official, diplomat serving as the 71st U.S. Secretary of State. And skip some of that. During Clinton administration, he served in the State Department in senior positions on the National Security Council. He's a senior fellow at CSIS. He advocated the 2003 invasion of Iraq while serving as a Democratic staff director in the Senate. He was a foreign policy advisor to Joe Biden, and he served as deputy assistant to the president, national security advisor to the vice president. Then he moved into the private sector, co-founding WestX Advisors. He was born in Yonkers, New York, to Ashkenazi Jewish parents, and Donald M. Blinken, who later served as U.S. ambassador to Hungary. His maternal grandparents were Hungarian Jews. Blinken's uncle, Alan Blinken, served as the American ambassador to Belgium. So he's clearly in the diplomatic circle and raised in a family of diplomats as well as Jewish, one takes it, refugees from the Holocaust or from the pogroms or from some historical tragedies that happened in Central Europe. And I think, and I read somewhere that his roots actually do extend into the Ukraine. He attended the Dalton School, where then he moved to Paris with his mother Judith and Samuel Pizarre, who was the lawyer for Robert Maxwell.
Yeah.
Now, Robert Maxwell's daughter is on trial right now, which is being kept as quiet as absolutely possible, and she's being prosecuted by the daughter of James Comey, if you can believe that. Are they going to have some kind of a little, I don't know, marshmallow event in the evenings between the trial?
It's a bit incestuous, isn't it?
It's worse. Yeah, that's the exact word. I'm afraid to say. But
But
okay,
you know,
so
Blinken, I just on Blinken, one other thing, his time in Paris, one of his buddies at the school in Paris is Robert Malley, who is the person who did the back channel to Iran for the JPCOA, who has now been brought back in, but has, along with Blinken, is now somewhat of a war hawk as opposed to someone who is trying to find a way out of the crisis. Malley may be better than that, but this is where you see the breeding grounds of the foreign policy elite. Besides this, many of them have Oxford, Cambridge, and also an important place is Tufts, the small college, liberal arts college in New England, where you have foreign policy training. And then Georgetown is the other place. But the key to Blinken right now is that he's being put forward all over the world. I mean, he's doing more traveling by far than secretaries of state usually do. And he's putting out a message. He was just in Africa recently. The message is the rules based order is here to stay. If you work with us, we'll take care of you. If you don't, woe be to you. And, you know, this is what we've seen from the last administrations, from what George W. Bush said, you're either for us or against us. And then we saw the same thing with Obama, where the United States increased the numbers of countries that we invaded and destroyed. There was somewhat of a halt to that, at least in terms of new attacks during the Trump period. But we pull out of Afghanistan, and now we're building up in Ukraine and the Black Sea, and also all over Asia. So, you know, Blinken is clearly part of this unilateralist war hawk faction that believes that diplomacy only works if you use it backed up by the threat of military activity. This is classic British policy. And I think that's the relevant point about him. His connection to Ukraine, I don't know too much about it, but you know, we do know that when the Ukrainian coup took place, the regime change coup in February 2014, John Kerry was heavily involved in this, and Blinken was the Deputy Secretary of State under Kerry for a period of time. Also, Jonathan Weiner worked under Kerry. Weiner was one of the links between the British networks and the FBI in putting together the Russiagate story. So, you know, you have, again, the incest spread out through these diplomatic channels.
well, you said the word mafia a little while ago. I said Robert Maxwell in connection to Blinken, and we have characters like Igor Kolomoisky to deal with, and others that are basically out as mafiosi. And I wonder to what extent Blinken may, in addition to his role as an official diplomat for the Biden administration, may be doing some kind of behind-the-scenes negotiation with underworld, with dark figures that are not, that don't want to be talked about, but it actually have a huge financial interest in the outcome.
When you're talking about the mafia, you have on the one side what we know from The Godfather and these stories about the organized crime networks, which is a fictional case. And I don't mean just the Godfather, but the fictional story about the mafia. The mafia actually functioned going back to World War II as an arm of US military and intelligence operations. The mafia was brought in to patrol the docks in the New York City area. Lucky Luciano was sent into Sicily to prepare the way for the US invasion. The role of people like Meyer Lansky in Cuba and the mafia in money laundering and the connection between that and banking. You know, we still see that. You know, I wrote stories in the 80s about Michael Milken's network, where the money that went into leveraged buyouts and junk bonds was coming from the inherited fortunes made by Lansky and Luciano and these networks, the real organized crime networks, that then went into Wall Street, in some cases through Las Vegas, but eventually into the leverage buyout, the Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts, and so on, which are part of the whole network which funds DARPA and the dark side of the military industrial complex. So it is a mafia in the real sense. I mean, maybe they don't have pinky rings and trade blood oaths with each other, but the effect is the same. It's a gang of a cabal of criminals who have the capacity to leverage the money into political power and use the US government and US military to carry out their operations, including drug money laundering. There was a period of time in which before the Federal Reserve took over as the main source of fresh money on a daily basis, there was a period of time where the most cash circulation in the world was coming through organized crime networks operating through banks such as the Hongshang Bank, Hong Kong, Shanghai, HSBC. BCCI was one of those banks. There were a whole group of these banks that were interfacing military intelligence and drug networks. That's relevant to this day as to why it is the State Department and the Treasury refused to release the $9 billion that's Afghan government money to the Afghan people. Because I am very suspicious, and we're putting together a report on this, that the intent of starving the Taliban is to create a circumstance where the Taliban will allow the return of all the opium networks. And in fact, the only time the opium networks weren't so dominant in Afghanistan was 1999, 2000, when the Taliban did a crackdown. After we invaded in 2001, the opium poppies flourished again. And opium from Afghanistan is not only a source of liquidity, but it's a source of destroying populations in places such as China, Russia, Eastern and Western Europe, and the United States through heroin trafficking. So the term mafia is not an exaggeration. It's an organic description of this dynamic.
And that ties into the Smith-Mundt issue. And can we separate investment banks from speculative banks? Because and I think it's Jeffrey Steinberg of your organization that did a great expose on that, which I recommend. It's still fine. You can find it on YouTube, where he talks about how this was when the money laundering was allowed to come into the real economy. And
Yeah.
when you allow these questionable accounts to become fungible with everybody else's good money, then of course that's going to not only dilute the value, but also make it impossible to prosecute the criminals, because the money's clean now. They're no longer holding a bag of dirty money. So this whole financial system, and BCCI comes to mind when we're mentioning the Comey family, because Comey was one of the directors of BCCI. So here you have what looks to me to be the takeover of important government offices, the head of the FBI, the head of the Justice Department, the head of the State Department, by people who have tangible, obvious, organized crime connections that need to be fleshed out, that need to be seen. And because what are they going to do? If you went to James Comey and said, hey Comey, we got you. Look at this book. We just wrote a book about you. We're going to trash you. You're going to go down, in history as the worst human being that ever lived. And he says, well, I can't stop you from publishing it, but if I go along with what you're saying, then that's the end of me. These people are all in a scheme. Maybe they didn't exchange, bloody fingers, but they sure did swear some kind of oath somewhere. Maybe it was in the Skull and Bones down in the crypt, or maybe it was just somebody took you in the back room one day and said, now we're going to let you in on this, but remember, you can't talk. And this is what's going on right now, Harley, is that there are a whole lot of people out there that just can't talk. That's what I think.
Well, let me give you an example of how this worked in the 80s. Uh, there were several cases against Hongshang Bank, Hong Kong Shanghai, which was originally set up after the Second Opium War against China. The British set up the bank as an explicit bank for money laundering from the drug traffic. And this was challenged briefly by the League of Nations after World War I, where there was so much money flowing through Hong Kong, through Hongshang, that it was brought up for investigation. And when they were asked to bring their books, they brought a set of clean books, and they were asked, well, where's the big money that's not showing up here? And they say, oh, we always keep a second set of books. And the League of Nations never pursued it. Well, in 1981, after several fines in the late 70s for money laundering, in this case out of Mexico, the Hongshang Bank applied for a license to set up branch operations in New York State. They went to the New York State Banking Commission. And the person at the time who ran it was someone named Muriel Siebert. And we provided her the documentation, some of which is in the book, Dope Incorporated. You mentioned Jeffrey Steinberg. He's one of the authors of a book that we published called Dope Incorporated, which had an enormous impact in the end of the 70s, early 80s. And Siebert declined to give a license to Hongshang to operate in New York State. So they went to the Federal Reserve as a national bank and got certified to run their operation in New York State as a national bank. So they had their approval from the Fed. And Hongshang, since that time, there are at least 5 or 6 separate cases brought against them for billions of dollars of drug money laundering, for which they end up paying a small fine. You know, the biggest fine they had once was, I think, $800 million. It's less than $1 billion. It's less than the money they launder in a 24-hour period. So it's no big, it's basically a cost of doing business. The profile of the bank is the same as it was in the when it was set up in the 1860s through the 1920s, through the 80s, 90s, up to today. A huge flow of funds come from questionable sources. No one's going to go after it because they operate under the protection of the City of London through the offshore tax laws and bank tax havens and banking laws that exist for British banks. So this is a real vulnerability for the security of the United States. We saw it in operation with the Iran-Contra affair. That's where BCCI became somewhat known. But there are many other examples of this. And, you know, instead we went after Manuel Noriega when the real drug pushers were the friends of George Bush, who was the one who was bringing cocaine into the country by the plane load.
Yeah, that Noriega story is something I don't know if you read Chip Tatum's account of that, but it all involves William Barr coming down as the heavy and saying, "Hey, you guys shrunk my underwear." In other words, where's the rest of the money? Where's the money,
Yeah.
Lebowski? And that was Barr's deal, was he was just going to make sure that and from George Webb's investigation, it looks like that money might have ended up with Hillary Clinton and her people. A little bit of difference of opinion as to where money should go between the Clintons and the Cheney.
And the Bushes.
Yeah, the Bush people. But
Well, then they became family, so it was okay.
Oh yeah, well, like I said, they all roast marshmallows after the show together. And but let me, if I may, I'm going to share my screen for a second. Oops. Yeah, let me go ahead and do this one. Just because I thought I had read this somewhere, and here it's probably worth sharing. So let me just read this. Oops, share. How do I share? Push that. Yiddish and the Ukrainian Jewish roots of the new U.S. Secretary of State, November 30th, 2020. Ukrainian Jewish Encounter is the name of the website. I'm not familiar with it. A picture of Mr. Mayor Blinken at right, and at right, his great-grandson, Tony Blinken, center the Yiddish newspaper Der Kibetzer. And when Joe Biden is sworn in as new president of the United States. An important member of his government will be Tony Blinken, who has been chosen as the next Secretary of State. Tony Blinken has long-standing ties with Ukraine, and not just because he oversaw the situation in Ukraine after the Maidan in 2014 to 16 in the Obama administration. How about that? Meyer Blinken, Tony Blinken's great-grandfather, was born in 1879 in Pereyaslav, the birthplace of the famous Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem. I know you love the Jewish writer Sholem Aleichem, so I thought this might be something you'd take a hold of. It's clear that that Blinken and his family are tied into deep roots in Central Europe, and that clearly includes Ukraine from this very interesting article.
You know what it reminds me of, John? The Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was from a minor Polish nobility family, had a pathological hatred of Russia. And now that you mention this Blinken Ukrainian route, there are two aspects to this. There were a lot of people in Ukraine, including Jewish Ukrainians, who had no problem with Russia. I mean, they didn't like the pogroms and things of that sort, but they also realized that Russia was a nation, had a culture, and Sholem Aleichem and his grouping were just asking, let us in, let us be part of the society. But you had others who had developed a pathological hatred of Russia, just as Brzezinski did from his Polish nobility roots. And these are people who get recruited into the State Department, into the think tanks, channeled through groups like the Atlantic Council or the Brookings Institute. Another person like this we're just looking into right now is Fiona Hill, who you may remember from the Ukraine impeachment hearings. Fiona Hill came through British universities and through Brookings Institute. She's the one who was involved in the recruitment of Danchenko as the source ultimately for the Christopher Steele report. And so the fact that how did she remain in the Trump administration as a Russian expert is an interesting question. But the difference, people like Sholem Aleichem, who were part of the Yiddish Renaissance, their view was they didn't want to go to Israel. They weren't part of the Zionist movement. They wanted their civil rights in Russia. And it was only when they concluded that it was impossible that many of them fled to New York, Miami Beach. That's where some of my relatives came from. But they were not pathologically anti-Russian, the way someone like Brzezinski is. And from listening to Blinken, this is an interesting lead you've given me. I'm going to take a look at it because it does make sense that this has a lot to do with Blinken. Even as Biden is talking about reaching certain agreements with the Russians, Blinken is out there waving around the sword every single day against Russia and China.
It takes me back to Theodor Herzl and the whole incipience of the Zionist movement at the behest of the British and Palmerston and that whole scenario that we've talked about many times. But when you look at the justification for what Herzl wanted, his idea of a Zionist movement was that, hey, we are going to be the intellectual elite. We're going to be part of the European aristocracy in a sense that we have arrived, which is what you're saying that the Yiddish Renaissance was saying. Hey, we want to sit at the table too.
But the difference.
They didn't go. Yeah, big difference because they didn't.
The difference was with the Yiddish Renaissance was that they were saying that what Sholem Aleichem and others said is that the Jews should not self-isolate. That if the Russians don't want to give us rights, well, that's the Russians' problem. But we should not reject the outside world, because one of the problems with the Jewish ghettos was that there was a kind of a, let's protect ourselves by not mixing with the outside world. And the Yiddish Renaissance goes back to Moses Mendelssohn, who said, look, there's validity in the philosophical, scientific work in the outside world. We shouldn't cut ourselves off to that. And that's what Sholem Aleichem said. And in his funniest writings, he often, makes fun of those people in the Jewish community who are terrified to think about what it means to live in a Christian society. And he said, look, let's bring our intelligence and our ideas and make fun of ourselves for running away from it. So the Yiddish Renaissance was actually, it's attacked sometimes for being assimilationist by people who say, no, you have to be a separate people. But I think the people who get recruited, look, a lot of the neocon movement was Jewish ex-Trotskyites, like Norman Podhoretz and the father of William Crystal. These were people who basically said, we can do your dirty work better than anyone else. And that's why you find so many like the Wolfowitzes around. It's not the Jewish religion. It's a grouping within Judaism that said, we're going to join the big boys and carry a big club, and we're going to become rich and have influence. And they'll turn on anybody. So that's partly what you see. It's what was identified as the Bedelheim syndrome. Join the oppressors.
Gosh, isn't it? I mean, you've studied it from the Yiddish Jewish perspective, and I've studied it from the Irish and Scottish perspective, and you have the exact same thing.
Yeah.
You have an opportunity, and that really comes right down to my dad. Is that if you want to be part of our thing, then we'll make you financially comfortable. You'll have we have your back. We're going to look out for you. You're going to make a steady increase in your salary through life. Your kids will go to college, and everything is going to look great. But you've got to be a part of it, and that means you've either got to go through the smelly robe ceremony or something, and then they're probably going to put you through some type of a brownstone operation too, where they'll put you into some compromising position with cameras rolling, and then they'll have that on you, kind of like a J. Edgar Hoover Lansky thing. I've got you, J. Hoover, so don't push me too hard, because I got pictures. And that kind of thing, I think, is probably quite evident from Ghislaine Maxwell, however you say her name, and the setting up of people for sexual compromise is really a huge part of the way that they get business done behind the scenes, and things like that lead to this ridiculous kangaroo court trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, where they're not letting the press in, they're not letting the people in, and every piece of evidence is getting sealed by the judge so that we can't look at it. This is all a Mickey Mouse trial, hidden from the press, hidden from the media, and who don't want to look at it anyway because they don't want to see it. They don't want to tell the country how corrupt, how rotten, how sexually blackmailed, how disgusting the real scene is behind the curtain in this country. But that's what's going on in this trial, and they're going to cover it up, and it'll be swept under the rug, and it'll be over with, just like Jeffrey Epstein himself. Whatever happened to him? Is he sipping mojitos in Madagascar somewhere? I don't know, but I haven't seen a death certificate. Well,
sometimes they do kill them because it's easier to keep them quiet. But
yeah.
I just on this note, let me just bring up something that came up in the last week, which when you talk about people who sell out, people who start with the intention of doing something useful and end up as an enemy of the truth, look at the media and Russiagate. There was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times a couple weeks ago by a guy whose name is Bret Stephens, who's one of the in-house conservatives at the New York Times. And it was essentially titled The FBI Department of Dirty Tricks. But it started out with something interesting. In the opening paragraph, he makes the point that the Danchenko indictment is a major embarrassment for much of the news media. and that he makes the point that there were journalists who carried the water for the FBI. Then he goes into a big attack on the FBI. Now, look, the FBI is easy to attack on Russiagate because they were both incompetent and corrupt. Yeah, there's the op-ed. But in the op-ed itself, he makes the point that he thinks Russia did intervene in the U.S. elections and that there was a legitimate question as to what Russia was doing. So, the New York Post actually had a much better article on this, taking Stevens' point that the question is not just the FBI. What about all the reporters who got higher positions, more money, retailing the lies of the FBI? The FBI knew they were reporting lies on the Steele dossier. That's what came out in the 3 indictments so far from Durham. The FBI knew these were lies. The source of the lies included people in the Clinton camp. This guy Dolan, who was planning the stories. Donchenko was coming through Fiona Hill and Clifford Gaddy, who were 2 anti-Putin experts. Gaddy, by the way, was a former member of our organization 30 years ago. These are people who turned to function on behalf of the FBI. But what about the reporters who reported this? There were, I think, 6 reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post who got Pulitzer Prizes in 2018 for their coverage of Russiagate, which we now know was all rubbish. What about all the fact checkers who said anyone who said that the Russiagate is wrong is lying, giving them 3 or 4 Pinocchio noses? What about the editorials that said Putin and Trump were definitely in collusion? What about journals like The Guardian, formerly the London Guardian, whose Luke Harding made himself famous writing a book called Collusion, in which he said Christopher Steele was absolutely right in everything he said about Putin and Trump? Why is Harding still working, not just still working for The Guardian, but still promoting anti-Russian lies? Go a little bit further. What about the media stories covering up the role of the British intelligence in lying about alleged Syrian use of chemical weapons? What about these lies? What about the lie that was put out, again, from British intelligence initially, about the Russians paying a bounty for killing Americans in Afghanistan? These are dangerous stories that reporters who tell these stories and write them and then are interviewed on major channels get paid a lot of money. Look at Rachel Maddow. I think she makes almost $1 million per evening that she's on MSNBC. She's been caught in lie after lie after lie. So where is the what would you call it? The not retribution, but when are these people going to be brought to task? Well, Stevens writes this article, which a lot of people said, oh, finally, the New York Times is admitting they were lying. No, it's not that. He's admitting the FBI was incompetent, but in a sense, he's still protecting the journalists who were part of this corruption. So this is where you have to look if you want to ask, why don't we have honest debate in this country on crucial issues? This is where the media corporations intersect the military-industrial complex, the intelligence communities, the corporate cartels, and so on. And Robert Maxwell, as you point out, look what Maxwell did. He set up a media empire, and then he stole the pension funds of the people who worked for his newspapers. And he met an untimely end, falling off his yacht, supposedly, I think off the coast of Spain. And his daughter is a fixer for Epstein, but who's she fixing, getting under Epstein's control? People like Prince Andrew. Who knows who else was involved in this? We'll never know, because that's probably the reason they killed Epstein, and she's not going to tell the story.
No, but we can see it. We can see from a broader point of view, from stepping back and say, my God, this is a bunch of corrupt people that are very, very deeply corrupt and going back generations. And as far as the media, I I read, as you know, I've been reading um, How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry, a man who has passed away, but he took a lot of care in writing this book. It's like 500 pages long, and it's the only book of that length that I've chosen to read the whole thing on my show. And I'm nearly to the end of it now. But one of the things that stuck with me is a quote from Benjamin Franklin when long before the revolution, long before the Declaration of Independence, when he was talking about how there is a fourth force in public affairs beyond the three estates or the king and the church and the whatever the people. The one that he's singled out is the newspapers or the media, and he said by using the media, we can change the way people think, the way that people look at the world, and we can generate a movement for revolution. And they did. And, they brought Tom Paine in and the incredibly gifted writer, uh, and they used the media. Well, then when they set up the Constitution, right, they had three branches of government, checks and balances. What could go wrong? Well, what went wrong was the media.
Yeah.
Because right away you had the Adams people throwing mud at the Jefferson people and the Jefferson people throwing mud at the Adams people. And back and forth and back and forth. And then, then you end up with a two-party system that we're stuck with. So once you reduce the government's decisions to a digital, yes, no, red, blue, Democrat, Republican form, then the role of reason kind of disappears.
Well, and there goes the discussion process. There goes the
Right.
debate, because you automatically assume someone who disagrees with you for a personal bias, as opposed to maybe they have a legitimate point. And so you end up with the polarization. Look, that Graham Lowry book is in my view one of the best books ever written on the background to the United States.
Mhm.
And I would urge people, if you can find it, I think there's still some copies available. I think a Kindle edition is available, but it's an extraordinary bit of scholarship. And Graham was really, I knew him when I first joined. He was teaching at Rutgers Newark at the time, but quite a scholar, and I really recommend it.
Well, Harley, I'm going to be publishing a complete playlist as soon as I read the last chapter of it, and I want to make it available to everybody, because a lot of people don't have the time to read, but they do have the time to turn on and listen while they're doing other chores or while they're watching, while they're doing something else online. You can be listening to this book and absorbing it, and I'm up to 28 1-hour segments so far, so it'll take a while. But I'm going to publish the whole. Yeah, really, but I'm going to publish the whole thing because I agree with you. Nobody can understand what the predicament of the United States today without understanding what happened in the 18th century, not just the 19th century. Everybody knows the Civil War. Everybody knows the American Revolution. Some people can say, yeah, I know the French and Indian War, but go back behind that. And there's a big gap between the Pilgrims and the French and Indian War that nobody knows about. And this is where the idea of freedom, this is the idea of a republic based upon the will of the people, it has been developed through people like Jonathan Swift, through Alexander Spotswood, through all the other positive Republican people that were active in that century. And without them, we wouldn't have gotten here. What we have here is completely unique. There's nothing anywhere else in the world based on a written constitution that is so respected that it is universally deferred to as the supreme law of the land. That's what the difference is between the people that are saying we want a quote rules-based order and the
Yeah.
rest of us, because the rest of us are just saying, well, we got a constitution. What else do you want? We're good. But the people,
And I think the important thing
Yeah.
is when people see that this was about a 100-year process of development before the debates in Philadelphia in the 1770s and 80s, you get an idea that the founding fathers had something behind them, which is a tradition of discussion, of fight. They tried to do something to change the relationship with Great Britain. Franklin was in Great Britain trying to talk to some of the British to say, look, just give us our rights. And the Brits, of course, couldn't do that. It gives you real insights to the historic problem we face when it comes to the United Kingdom. That LaRouche was not just making stuff up about the British. That's the nature of the establishment in Britain that corrupted and took over the establishment in the United States.
I think that's a good spot to leave it, Harley.
Okay, John.
That's where we're stuck right now, and we're gonna keep on digging our way out of this mess together. Thank you so much for your insight and sharing all of your great experience and wisdom and thoughts. And it's just a terrific pleasure for me to have this conversation. So I look forward to the next one.
Okay, see you in 2 weeks.
All right, Harley. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you tonight, Bill Taylor. Don't forget, you guys, Bill Taylor be on tonight, 8 p.m. here on the same channel. McDuff Lives too.